Welcome, everybody. I'm Ashish Kaushal, co-founder of Consciously Unbiased, a movement to build belonging in the workplace. I'm really excited about today's topic. We have some very special guests, the authors of the newly released Women in the Workplace 2022 report, which found that we are in the middle of a great breakup, where women leaders are demanding more from work and are more likely to switch jobs to get their needs met. Today's conversation will cover some of the biggest factors behind this trend and how to better retain women leaders. But first, I want to introduce our guests. We're speaking with Rachel Thomas. She's co-founder and CEO of leanin.org, and Lareina Yee, senior partner at McKinsey Company. Welcome.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. It's great.
And I'd love to start off with, can you share with us what surprised you most about this year's Women in the Workplace 2022 report findings?
So I'll jump in there. It is that great breakup finding. You know, for the first time that we've been tracking, women are leaving their companies at higher rates than men and at the highest rate we've ever seen. And this is leaving their company, not leaving the workforce. And of course, it really matters because we know that women are already underrepresented in leadership, and now companies are losing the precious few women leaders they do have. And to just put the scale of the problem into perspective, for every woman at the director level who gets promoted, 2 women directors are choosing to leave their company. So that's 1 up and 2 out.
Wow. That's a pretty scary stat. I mean, I think a lot around what we do in terms of competitive advantage as companies is making sure our leadership is there and it's diverse. And that's pretty much a huge issue from a competitive standpoint.
That's right.
Lareina, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I think it is a stunning stat, and apologies if my video isn't coming in clear. I think I'm having some Wi-Fi challenges. But the question that Rachel brings up is, why is that happening? And I think you have to kind of look to the title of this, which is consciously unbiased. And so what's happening day to day? You know, it's interesting. Close to 40% of women leaders have found that a coworker has taken credit for their ideas this year. They're 2 times more likely to be mistaken for someone much younger, almost undercutting their sense of seniority or authority. And they're also far more likely to spend time on DE&I, which is wonderful. But guess what? Less than 40% of them actually receive annual credit for that work. And so when you look at the 1 up, 2 out statistic, which is very shocking, part of it shouldn't be surprising because we can take a look at the day-to-day signals, and women aren't being supported for further advancement. And they're saying, you know, maybe I should go somewhere else with my talent.
No, absolutely. And do you think, I mean, in terms of, in the report, you guys talk about the great breakup and the factors driving women to leave. What do you think the policies that should be put in place to sort of retain women leaders? And I'll give you an example of one of the things that we teach is at Consciously Unbiased. When we talk about recruiting strategies with clients, they say they want to hire a certain demographic. And so, for example, like women in the workplace, well, you need to make your policies welcome them, for example. So the women are still generally the caregivers. So if their kids are going to go to school late for a snow day, we have to make sure the policy is flexible that allows them not to feel guilty about staying late to drop their kid off and then coming in and leaving early. And as long as they get their work done, then who cares how it's being done, right? And so building those welcoming policies are one of the things that we always teach about. But I'd love to hear about your thoughts, because I think it's much deeper than what I just suggested.
Yeah, let me start by setting the table kind of for why they're leaving, you know, what we know from this year's study. And then Lareina can jump in with, you know, what we can do about it, and we can talk about that. So in terms of why they're leaving, we asked employees, and we surveyed over 40,000 employees of all genders. We asked them, if you've left your job within the last 2 years, why? And not surprisingly, everybody points to more opportunity and more money. Of course, that's a motivator for all of us. And as Lareina kind of unpacked, where it gets tricky when you talk about women in opportunity is women are getting signals that it's going to be harder for them to advance in their organization. So it's not surprising they are more likely to look elsewhere for opportunity. But the real gender differences in terms of why employees are choosing to leave their companies were really around flexibility. All employees value flexibility. It was the number one thing they looked for before the pandemic. And now, obviously, many are placing a premium on it. But flexibility is more important to women. And that's not surprising, right? They do more work at home. We know from our research and other research, they do more work in the workplace. They're more likely to show up as good people managers, to check in on employee well-being, to help employees balance their workload, and they're more likely to be champions of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And those are the other two things that women employees are signaling are really important to them. They want to work for organizations that value employee well-being and are investing in it, and value diversity, equity, and inclusion and are investing in it. So they're just as ambitious as men. In fact, during the pandemic, women under 30 signaled they were more ambitious. 2/3 of women under 30 want to be senior leaders. They want to advance. So this isn't about ambition, but it is about women really signaling they want to work for an organization where they feel that they're going to be able to advance and they have equal opportunity, and they want to work for organizations that value the things they do: flexibility, well-being, and diversity, equity, and inclusion.
And so do you think we need to measure productivity differently, right? Rather than face time, how much time you're doing, but more by objectives?
So one of our recommendations is we need a shift to results, to focusing on what you're getting done, how effectively you're leading, and not where and when you're doing it. So that is certainly part of it. And I'm going to let Lareina jump in and talk about, a lot of other things that we think organizations can be doing.
It's a great push. So absolutely, it should be measured on outcomes. What do you deliver, not whether you show up from 9 to 5 and show your face 5 days a week, as Rachel was saying. But it's more than that. It's the actual management framework for how do you hold people accountable for the people mission of your company, not just the financial results. And so what does that include? If you value DE&I, and the vast majority of companies say it's a top 10 priority, then it should be reflected in your operating model. So that would mean that you not only have transparency of the data, but it's in your performance scorecards and it's next to your business results. It also include the formal things like sponsorship, allyship, mentorship, that you would actually reward people for that. You would put that into their performance review, either in terms of formally recognizing their work or actually tying incentives to outcomes around diversity. You might also take the training for managers much more seriously, to give them the tools to go beyond positive intent and actually have a set of capabilities to lead in a very conscious and intentional way that's inclusive of everyone, not simply women, but all diversity and folks that you have there. And I could keep going, but I think what it means is that if you want to live into something where you say this is a priority, then you need to reflect that in actually how you manage day to day. And we do find that companies that are making more progress, Rachel and I saw this in the data this year, and we've seen it year over year over the last 8 years, companies that are making more progress tend to have these types of practices over others who are just wishfully thinking that maybe things will get better because they said it's important.
And
I was going to say, you also, one of the things you guys brought up in the beginning of this conversation was about expecting women to sort of support the D&I initiatives, but then not being compensated for it. And I always say, it's great through all the things that have happened the last few years. We've externally facing put a lot of money towards causes, but I think part of it is also making sure that you're giving budgets to your ERG groups and giving budgets to the people who are championing them and giving them bonuses for producing that, because I think outcomes happen if they're backed by not just the leadership, but also the financial part of it.
That's exactly right.
I just want to clarify that it doesn't have to be financial. I mean, the overall piece is, are you tying it more formally to performance? It could be financial, it could be non-financial incentives, but it is a more formal recognition of the work that women are doing. And let's just make sure that when they are stepping up to be leaders in a balanced way that's looking at the agenda and objectives of people health as well as the business health, that they're not doing that on a pro bono basis. They are leaders and they should get credit for that. And I think how companies do that, I think that is a little bit of their own science and math in terms of how they want to do that. Financial is one of many ways that they can do that. But there are many other ways that companies can do it. But the key thing is, are they actually tying it in a formal way?
Absolutely. Rachel, you were saying?
Well, I was going to say, building what Lareina said, one of the findings this year, which is consistent with what we've seen over the years, is companies are placing a higher premium on employee well-being and on diversity, equity, inclusion. They're expecting more of their managers in both areas. And yet, when you look at performance reviews, the vast majority of companies, not surprisingly, look at business results in performance reviews, but relatively few look at things like employee morale, team retention, a sense of well-being and inclusion on a team. And so what's happening effectively, building on what Lareina said, is companies are rewarding the business results, but they're not recognizing and rewarding making progress on people management and diversity, equity, inclusion, yet they're signaling those are critically important. And then they're also, expecting more of managers and not always providing the training and the support to make sure that managers really know how to show up. What does it look like to be a manager that supports well-being? What does it look like to foster inclusion on a team and making sure they're set up for success? And how this links back to women and women's experience in women's leaders is that they are more committed naturally and are doing more naturally to support employees and to support diversity, equity, inclusion. So as we start to recognize it and reward it, it will incentivize all managers to step up and do more. But it also means that women leaders who are already doing it are more likely to be recognized and advance.
No, absolutely. And the training part, I think, is really critical, because I don't think, no matter what your level at or what level you're at, I think we've kind of gone through this sort of trial by fire environment where we went from being in the office and managing people directly to managing over Zoom remotely over the last 2 years. And I don't think anyone's really put the effort and time in to sort of build the training on how do you make a culture of inclusion and retention. And that's directly affects your ROI. And so I think that's a key part of what needs to be done. And I think that report highlights that as well. Can you talk to us about why women are more likely to say, why Black women are more likely to say they want the top job in leadership compared to women overall?
Well, I think it's good news that we see an incredible level of positive ambition among women of color. And we see that for Black women specifically. We also see that for Asian women and Latino women. So the good news is that women of color are incredibly positively ambitious. They want to be leaders in their organization. One might posit that perhaps one of the reasons they want to be leaders in their organization is to actually be a decision maker, so that that environment reflects the type of environment that they would like to work in, but they would like to do that. Now, one of the interesting things is that when women of color say, and Black women say they want to be leaders, it's pretty remarkable, because their day-to-day experience is consistently much worse than that of white women and that of men. And so I think it also just speaks to enormous resilience that you have that. And we know that there are very basic day-to-day things that make a huge difference in the experience of Black women. One thing that Rachel and I have spent a lot of time looking at is allyship. That's standing up for someone who's different from you. And we found that women, Black women who have allies, have a markedly different experience, much closer to their interests in terms of happiness, feeling supported, wanting to advance, much closer to that of white women. And Black women without allies have just such a crushing experience, and it reflects in their sense of satisfaction in the companies that they're at, their likeliness to stay. And so I just point out that part of this is not incredibly difficult. Some of this is day-to-day common sense things that we would hope are norms in the workplace. And when they're in place, makes a huge outsized difference on Black women.
And that makes sense. Allyship is very important. Rachel, one of the things that was really interesting in the report was that younger women are redefining what leaders look like. They're prioritizing work-life balance, but they're not saying that just because I want work-life balance doesn't mean that I should be moving further through my career much faster. And so I thought that was a really interesting point about career advancement. Can you kind of talk to us about that?
Well, I think what we're seeing from younger women, so women under 30, first of all, as I kind of mentioned earlier, they actually became more ambitious during the pandemic, not less ambitious. But all of those things that we talked about that matter to women leaders, flexibility, commitment to well-being, commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, so a culture of work that works for everybody, are more important to younger women. So I think what they're effectively saying is, we're ambitious, we're focused on our career, but we're not going back to the status quo when it comes to work. We want work to continue to move forward. We've seen what companies could do during the pandemic when they had to. We've seen that additional commitment to well-being. We've seen them double down on flexibility and remote and hybrid work, and we don't want to go back. And I think zooming out, I think this speaks to, it's been interesting as we've been out interviewing on these findings. We've been asked a lot, well, how can you be deeply ambitious and yet really be, prioritizing flexibility, well-being, DE&I, the culture of work. And I think what we need to start to do is realize that it is not mutually exclusive, that you're deeply ambitious, that you want to be a senior leader, that you're committed to your career, and you want work to fit into your life. Those are not mutually exclusive ideas. And I think that's what young women are signaling.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. And there's no one ever talks about efficiency, right? Like I can show up for 40 hours and then sit at my desk for 26 hours and actually work for 14 hours. And that's considered a 40-hour week.
Right? Yes. So that's why this switch to results, not where and when you work, but what are you accomplishing? And not only just what are you accomplishing, but how are you doing it? Do people feel good at the end of a project? Do teams feel supported? Do people feel energized? The how we work is many times and increasingly as important as what we're producing.
Absolutely.
But it also is interesting because from a hard numbers perspective, being flexible about work is also an unlock for talent. So for example, if you're flexible about work, you're not just flexible about the hours, you're probably flexible about location, which means that you can source talent from a broader array of schools. If you're just coming out of university, a broader array of locations. We know that Black talent in America, both men and women, are highly concentrated in about 11 states. If you happen to not have an office in those states, but you are thinking very differently about how you show up at work and what that flexibility looks like, you actually open up talent pools that you hadn't had access to before. And so we are seeing that this flexibility and this sense of choice is incredibly healthy for a lot of reasons.
And then did you guys, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, in fact, that's one of the biggest benefits, not surprisingly, that companies point to when you think about remote and hybrid work is the ability to not only recruit, but to retain more diverse talent.
No, absolutely. And then from a personal experience and also just from the report, have you found that remote work and distributed work environments have actually helped reduce the amount of microaggressions men may push on minorities and women? Has it helped, or do you think it's hurt us overall?
Well, the data shows that it helps. So in a remote environment and in a hybrid environment, we have seen that microaggressions have gone down, and that is particularly true for women with disabilities. And I think for Rachel and I, that's what the numbers say, but I think underneath that, the stories are just incredibly powerful. So individual women that we've interviewed had said, I feel like I am more a member of this virtual table than I was before. Or women who just feel incredibly empowered to say, I can choose how I work. So I would like to be in the office 2 days a week. I'd like to be really intentional about when I'm together with my team, how I'm learning. But gosh, that flexibility on the other days is just making it so much easier. So maybe that's a woman who has 2 kids under 10, which we know is an incredibly hard time, both professionally and personally, and juggling. And we see that in the data year over year. Or a woman with disabilities who's saying that I actually have a much better day-to-day experience. And so we see it in the data, but we also see it in the stories, which is something that's just unbelievable every year when we do this report.
I love that. And then in terms of speaking of the hybridization, do you feel like we're going to continue down that path, or do you think companies that try to force us to come back to the office 5 days a week are the ones that are going to lose out?
Yeah, well, so we know a couple things. We know that most companies, HR leaders told us that they are going to continue to support hybrid and remote work when they can, right? Mm-hmm. And again, they point often to it allows them to diversify their workforce, hold on to employees. And our data now show that in many ways it helps them deliver a better work experience, particularly for women and other employees with traditionally marginalized identities. So I think remote work and hybrid work are absolutely here to stay. And I think that goes back to the conversation that we were having earlier. Now the question is, how do we get it to work for everybody? How do we make sure there's an even playing field regardless of where you're working? And that's a lot of that focus on results. That's teaching managers, how do you manage remote and hybrid teams? And then the final thing I would say on this is, we clearly see that flexibility is delivering a different day-to-day work experience for women. And on one hand, that is a very positive thing. Lareina and I, all of us, we want women to be having the best experience at work they can have. And that's particularly true for women of color and women with disabilities and women who are more likely on the receiving end of microaggressions or, othering and demeaning, everyday behavior. But it's also an indictment of corporate America to some degree. You shouldn't have to work at home at your kitchen table to be having a better work experience. So one of our big messages is, regardless of where and how your employees are going to work, you need to continue to invest in creating a work culture where we all feel valued, appreciated, a sense of belonging. And that doesn't matter if you're at Starbucks, you're in the office at your desk, or you're at home. We should all be experiencing, a healthy, collaborative, and supportive work culture. So it just means there's more work to be done, which is why conversations like these are so important.
I think that
I don't think anyone's ever positioned it that way. I really love the way you said that. Lareina, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say that in order to make work in person, or, whether you're in Starbucks or at home, this point on intentionality is really important. So when you are in the office, what are the sets of things that actually being together, being in person, makes a difference? Because if you're in the office in a little bubble and you're all kind of working on your computers, that's actually being in person. And so one of the things I hear from a lot of CHROs and business leaders is, how do we make the in-person time intentional and rich, and kind of how is it a force multiplier for connectivity, for networking, for teams? So thinking through less, I have Monday through Friday, but thinking through what are the sets of things where being together is really valuable, and what are the sets of things where people can work incredibly independently. And they can work independently if they want to use the physical location of the offices, or they can do it remotely. I think that's a huge thing. The second thing I would say is a sense of belonging. That ideal that you could bring that into work, that doesn't need to be squishy. That actually is measurable. And there are analytics and baselines that you can do and tools to actually make that more of a science than an art. And it would be great to see companies actually move that way, which isn't just for women. That's actually for your entire employee force.
Absolutely. I think you could definitely measure D&I and belonging through like quantitative and qualitative measures. And you really see the impact of people taking ownership of tasks and responsibilities. One of the things you guys mentioned in the report is that women are burning out at higher levels. Can you sort of dig deeper around that? And then the second part of my question to that is, do you think the hybridization of the fact that we come into work maybe 2 days a week actually would help reduce that burnout level?
So we know that 4 in 10 women this year said they always or almost always feel burned out. I want to be clear. And burnout, it is an issue across all employees of all genders. But yes, women do stand out for being a bit more burned out. And I really want to unpack that, because I don't want anybody listening to this or watching this, the takeaway to be at all that women are somehow less resilient or just more likely to be burned out. We know from years of research that women do more at home, significantly more. And what's interesting, as women and men get more senior in their careers, men start to do far less household work, and the same is not true for women. And then the other thing that we already talked about a lot during this conversation is that women are actually doing more in the workplace. Employees are looking to them around well-being and kind of making sure everybody's being taken care of in the workplace, particularly as we went through the pandemic and are now kind of figuring out this new way of working together. And women are investing more in diversity and equity inclusion outside of their core jobs. So they're doing everything else, and they're doing D&I work on top of it. In fact, senior level women are twice as likely to be doing D&I work outside their core job than senior level men. So when you take that all together, it's not surprising that women are more burned out. And I have to confess, I forget the second half of your question.
Going to the office and doing the hybridation model,
Oh,
does that help
yes.
reduce some of the burnout?
Well, so the other thing that we know is we've talked about microaggressions a lot, being mistaken for someone more junior, having your competence challenged in an area of expertise. For women of color, more othering microaggressions, being asked where you're really from, having someone, be surprised by your language skills or other abilities. And I mean, microaggressions, I think they may need a rebranding because they're not always micro, right? Like they really can have a deep impact. And regardless, they add up over time. So certainly, if you're experiencing fewer microaggressions and you're feeling more psychological safety working outside of the workplace, that helps fight burnout, right? And then certainly if you're at home more, where you have more flexibility and you can get creative about how you're fitting work into life, that helps with burnout as well. So there's no panacea, there's no easy fix, but certainly embracing flexibility and allowing all employees of all genders to kind of figure out how to fit work into life and then have, a better day-to-day work experience. Those are things you could do that will address burnout.
Absolutely. I will tell you one thing from my personal experience, because you talked about how women have managed the households, managed work, and I didn't realize how much work was done at the household until COVID happened, and how much I didn't do.
Well, we hear that a lot, actually. We hear that a lot. So one of the things that we see is, anecdotally, I hear a ton of this. And it's also interesting that the sentiment of men is different if they're less than 30. And so I am hopeful that there's a generational shift of either men who during COVID, who are maybe older than 30, have experienced sharing the load, or men who are coming up through the workforce in a younger generation whose expectation actually is that DE&I is a baseline. It's not a nice to have, it's a must have, and that includes balancing the load. The other thing that makes me quite hopeful is that increasingly you see policy shifts that aren't just for women, but are for parents. And as companies actually have a shift towards parental policies, what that's also saying is that men need to take 6-8 weeks off. Men may actually need to help with elderly care of family members. Men might actually go part-time because maybe the woman in that portfolio of a 2 working household has the bigger job. Mm-hmm. And when you see more of that behavior around parents and about making work and life all fit together as opposed to being a stark trade-off, it really changes the perception. And I think one of the perception shifts is that it doesn't seem as risky for a guy to say, I got to leave at 5 o'clock. I've got to pick up the kids. And tomorrow my wife's doing that. So this concept that you would share the load is more positive. That said, I still think we have a ways to go because the data shows exactly what Rachel said, which is over the last 8 years of doing this research, we see that women consistently have that triple shift, an extra shift at home, their work shift, and then increasingly the extra load of people care within the office.
I agree. I think we have to normalize care for the men as well, because I think, like, if I picked up a child from school, I get a medal, whereas you guys don't, and you just have to say that's your job as well, or my job as well.
There were no awards for me this morning when I dropped off my son with all the things and was on time for meetings at work. No,
my husband always jokes because there's two sides of this, that I'm a victim of high expectations, but he's a victim of low expectations. Like, he doesn't want to be celebrated for doing what anybody should be doing. And I totally agree with what you and Lareina are saying. Like, we need to normalize caregiving, whether that's elder care or parenting, or because too often when we talk about it, it's still a women's issue, and that does no good to women, and ultimately it doesn't do good to men either, who should feel the same freedom to take parental leave, to take time off to go, watch a soccer game. And so we really need to start talking more about parents and less about mothers.
I agree. Well said. So this is really interesting to me, and I really want to sort of let the audience know where they can get this report. So if somebody's interested in finding out more about Lean In and the organization and the report, where would they go to download that?
So to find out more about Lean In, you'd go to leanin.org. And to find out about the report, which is on both of our websites, but our shared website with the report is womenintheworkplace.org. And then I'll let Lareina jump in on where people can go to find McKinsey.
You can go to our website, McKinsey.com, and we have a whole diversity section, and you can read all the work that we do on diversity, all the work we do on women, and see that. And I think on both leanin.org and McKinsey.org, McKinsey.com, there are sets of tools and ideas for how you actually take action, which I think is a really important part of this, which is what we love about this report is it puts a flashlight on what to work on. But the next step is to then actually do the work. And that's the part that's actually the hard muscle. And hopefully what the report does is inspire people to roll up their sleeves and do the work.
Absolutely. So I have one last question for you both. At Consciously Unbiased, we have this idea around micro progressions, which is small action steps you can take to make work a more inclusive environment. And one of the ones that I really worked on during COVID was I didn't realize when you switch from in-person meetings to Zoom, you tend to talk over people, right? And so me talking over you, what does that send? That sends a message. My intent was just to get my point across, but what the message is being sent is your ideas and you're not important to me, which is a microaggression. So now I actively pause, listen, and then respond to the question you're actually asking rather than me barfing my ideas on you. So what's one microprogression you would like the audience to take away to help make work a more inclusive environment for women leaders?
Yeah, I'll jump in first. So I think you can do, I'd like to encourage people to look for opportunities to be micro sponsors and micro mentors. And what I mean by that is we often, I think mentorship and sponsorship are kind of huge, daunting responsibilities. But yet, if you just take someone aside after a single meeting and share an insight that's really valuable to them, you just micro mentored. And often one email advocating for someone can open up doors for them. And that's micro sponsorship. And of course, when you're micro mentoring and micro sponsoring, look for people that don't look like you. How are you lifting up people that don't look like you? Particularly if a white man find someone of color in your organization that you can micro mentor and sponsor.
I love that.
So two things. One is around resisting theater Zooms. And the second one is around one-on-ones virtually. So the theater Zoom is that you have 50 people on a Zoom because you can be very inclusive, although it's not inclusive because 3 people are talking the entire time and everyone's just watching them like a virtual amphitheater. That's not a discourse. That's not a debate. That's not improv. That actually is 3 people who just should have that meeting by themselves. And so I do think when you have a big Zoom room, actually make that something where other people are getting called out to say something. Consciously bring somebody who's very quiet into the conversation. And so I think that type of behavior is really important. So that's one thing I've learned. The second thing I've learned is that we keep thinking that everything's in groups. And we've lost a little bit of the virtual art of the one-on-ones, which we had a lot more, I think, in person. And this is just sort of my anecdotal experience. And so I try and do more little 15-minute Zooms one-on-one just to catch up with someone and ask how they're doing. And sometimes I actually just take the video off. We just do a phone call. How are you doing? What are some of the things you're trying to achieve over the next 6 months? How can I help? I can't have that conversation with someone with 20 people on the line. And certainly they're not going to feel very safe sharing with like everybody watching. Oh, what are we trying to work on? So those are my two micro progression nudges.
I love that. Both are very insightful. I really enjoyed this discussion, and I hope we can do many more of these. Thank you both for taking the time today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Hey, have a good day.